Status
847
report.
warships,
Any anomalies?
armed
Negative,
to the teeth,
Commanders.
I'm rerouting auxiliary
cannons
power.
charged,
Monitor closely.
shields locked. They surrounded a single small, impossibly dark vessel in the cold vacuum of space. The alien armada broadcast their demands across every known frequency. Surrender, submit, prepare for boarding. The commanders of the Calaron Empire thought they had cornered a stray animal. They thought they held all the cards. They thought their 10,000 years of absolute uncontested rule gave them the right to dictate who lived and who died among the stars. But they didn't know the truth of the void. They didn't know that on this day, they hadn't cornered a victim. They had awakened a sleeping God, and God was coming to collect her people. For 20 years, Senior Monitor Vexia had sat in the dim humming quiet of monitoring station Sentinel-7. She was a small cog in a machine so vast it defied comprehension. Her station floated at the absolute edge of mapped space. It was the boundary line. On one side lay the glowing, prosperous heart of the Calaron Empire. On the other side lay the uncharted, freezing dark. For 2 decades, Vexia had watched the screens. She tracked stray asteroids. She logged wandering comets. She recorded the occasional burst of cosmic radiation. Nothing moved out here. Nothing lived out here. It was a job defined by profound, unbroken boredom. Until the alarm sounded. It didn't start as a scream. It started as a soft, rhythmic chime. A polite notification from a system that had never in its operational history had a reason to interrupt her routine. Vexia blinked. Her 6-fingered hands paused over her datapad. She turned her head toward the primary sensor array frowning in the artificial twilight of the control room. The chime escalated, its shifted pitch rising from a gentle reminder to a piercing mechanical shriek. The sound echoed off the metal bulkheads vibrating in her teeth. She dropped her stylus. It clattered against the deck. Her hands flew across the holographic interface attempting to silence the auditory warning. The sound died, but the visual alert remained. It was flashing a violent, bloody crimson across the main glass. Contact detected. Vexia swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. She ran a system diagnostic, expecting the ancient hardware to finally reveal a fatal glitch. The computer responded with cold, logical calm. All systems functioning normally. No errors detected. Sensor calibration at 100%. She ran it again. Same result. She looked at the numbers cascading down the screen. They made no sense. They defied the laws of physics as the Empire understood them. The contact was moving at 0.97, the speed of light. Vexia leaned closer, her breath fogging the lower edge of the display. "That's impossible," she whispered to the empty room. The fastest military ships in the Emperor's Grand Fleet could barely reach 0.4 light speed, and that was only when they were willing to risk melting their own engines. Nothing moved at near light speed in real space. The mass alone would tear a vessel apart. But the speed wasn't the detail that made the blood freeze in her veins. It was the signature. Every vessel in the galaxy left a trace. Energy emissions from thrusters, heat bleeding from life support systems, electromagnetic chatter from navigation arrays. Every spacefaring civilization in the Empire's massive database had a unique fingerprint. The sensors at Sentinel-7 were designed to read those fingerprints from light years away. This vessel had nothing. No energy type matched the Imperial archives. No heat signature registered against the background radiation of space. No signals broadcast on any monitored frequency. It was a ghost. It was a shadow moving with devastating purpose, barely existing in the physical realm. Vexia opened the broadband communication channel. Her hand was trembling so badly she missed the activation toggle on the first try. Sentinel-7 to unknown vessel. You are approaching Calaron Empire territory. Identify yourself immediately and cut your speed. Silence. Only the quiet hiss of cosmic static answered her. She tried again, boosting the signal, broadcasting across the entire spectrum. Unknown vessel, this is the Sentinel-7 border monitoring station. You are on a collision course with sovereign space. Please respond and transmit your identification codes. Nothing. The dot on the screen didn't waver. It didn't slow down. It was cutting through the void like a bullet fired from a sniper's rifle, maintaining an absolutely perfect trajectory. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her years of bureaucratic conditioning. She reached for the emergency communication relay. It was a physical button encased in a protective housing. She had never touched it before. No monitor in this sector had touched it in 1,000 years. She slammed her fist down on the console. The screen flickered, bypassing local command and routing directly to the military logistics hub at the nearest core world. The face that appeared on her screen belonged to a junior logistics officer. He looked bored, annoyed, and deeply unimpressed by the frantic monitor on his display. Sentinel-7, this channel is reserved for verified military emergencies only, the officer said, not even looking up from his own reports. If you have a maintenance issue with your array, submit a form to engineering. I have detected an unknown vessel, Vexia interrupted, her voice cracking. The officer sighed. Monitor your sensors are ancient. They are likely misinterpreting a micrometeor shower. Run a full diagnostic, and I ran the diagnostics. Vexia snapped, her patience vaporizing. Twice. All systems are functioning. The contact is real. It's traveling at near light speed. It has zero identifiable signature, and it is not responding to hails. The officer finally looked up. A condescending smirk touched the corner of his mouth. Near light speed, without a signature. That's a good story. Sentinel-7, send me your raw data telemetry. I'll have an intern look at your ghost. Vexia didn't argue. She hit the transfer key, dumping the entire encrypted data package directly into the officer's terminal. She watched his face. It took exactly 4 seconds for the boredom to vanish. The smirk melted away, replaced by a pale, rigid mask of absolute terror. He stared at his screen, his eyes widening as the numbers registered in his mind. He didn't say a word to her. He didn't need to. He simply slammed his hand onto his own console, severing the connection and triggering a localized red alert. Vexia slumped back in her chair. She looked back at the main tactical plot. The contact hadn't changed course. It hadn't deviated by a fraction of a degree. It was heading straight for the inner colonies. 10 minutes later, her terminal lit up again. This time it wasn't a junior officer. It was Ambassador Calthor, a senior diplomat of the High Council flanked by military aides. His face was lined with tension. Sentinel-7, confirm your telemetry, Calthor demanded, skipping any formal greeting. We are receiving identical readings from Sentinel-4 and Sentinel-9. You are tracking a singular object. Yes, Ambassador, Vexia said, sitting up straight. It's moving right through the outer sensor net. It's ignoring all automated warnings. Then you believe this is a vessel, Calthor asked. Not an anomaly. An anomaly doesn't steer, Vexia said quietly. It's making micro-corrections to avoid debris fields. It knows exactly where it's going. The connection cut out. The machinery of the Empire, sluggish from millennia of peace, was finally grinding into motion. But it was too slow. Vexia did the math. She watched the speed, plotted the trajectory, and felt her stomach drop. At its current velocity, the ghost ship would breach the inner colony defense perimeter in 14 days. 14 days. A ticking clock counting down to a collision with an empire that hadn't fought a real war in recorded history. 13 days later, the clock had almost run out. Light years away in the strategic command center of the Imperial Pentagon, the nerve center of the Empire's military, might on Earth, Admiral Vorlog stood before a massive holographic projection of the galaxy. Vorlog was a creature of absolute authority. His uniform was immaculate. His posture was rigid. He had never tasted defeat because he had never faced an opponent worthy of the name. To him, the galaxy was a tamed garden, and he was its groundskeeper. Show me the intercept vector, Vorlog barked. A tactical officer rapidly keyed in the commands. A red line appeared on the map, originating from the deep black and terminating at a small, insignificant dot in the middle of the North American sector. It's not heading for the capital, the officer reported, confusion coloring his tone. It's bypassing the core military shipyards. It's projecting a direct course for Sector 793, the Rocky Mountain mining colonies. Vorlog narrowed his eyes. Why, there's nothing there but rocks and laborers. Is it a probe, a navigational error? Unknown, Admiral, but it will cross the lunar buffer zone in exactly 6 minutes. Once it crosses that line, the automated defense network will engage. Let it, Vorlog said coldly. If they refuse to answer our hails, they will answer to our guns. Scramble the first fleet. I want 200 warships waiting for them if they somehow survive the perimeter strike. Nobody walks into my house without knocking. The lunar buffer zone was a relic of a bygone era. Thousands of years ago, the Empire had seeded the orbital space with automated defense satellites. They were old, brutal machines. They didn't rely on energy weapons that could be deflected by shields. They relied on sheer, overwhelming kinetic force. Tungsten rods heavy as a school bus fired at staggering velocities. A single strike could crack a dreadnought in half. The red dot on the tactical map reached the boundary line. "Target is in range of the orbital defense grid," the tactical officer announced. The command center fell silent. Dozens of officers watched the screen waiting for the inevitable destruction of the arrogant intruder. Satellites locking on, firing. In the cold vacuum of space, three massive ancient machines rotated. Their targeting lasers painted the dark hull of the approaching ship. With a silent, violent shudder, they released their payload. Three kinetic kill vehicles tore through the void, accelerating toward the target. Inside the approaching vessel, there were no flashing red lights. There were no screaming alarms. There was only the low, steady, comforting heartbeat of a quantum core turning the very fabric of space-time into a superhighway. The ship was designated the Remembrance. It was small, it was dark, and it was completely alone. Captain Helena Sterling sat in the command chair. She didn't wear a uniform adorned with unearned medals or decorative sashes. She wore a simple, dark, heavy-duty jacket over a plain shirt, the clothes of someone who worked for a living. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face lined with the quiet, persistent exhaustion of a woman who had carried a profound burden for a very long time. But her eyes were sharp, steely, unforgiving. She held a ceramic mug in her right hand. The coffee inside was black, bitter, and steaming hot. She took a slow sip. It grounded her. It tasted like dirt, like home, like things that were real. "Captain," a calm, synthesized voice spoke from the ship's overhead speakers. "We have crossed the territorial boundary line. 3 hostile kinetic projectiles inbound. Impact estimated in 12 seconds. Helena didn't flinch. She didn't grip the armrests of her chair. She simply looked at the main view screen, watching the visual representation of the 3 massive tungsten rods hurtling toward her ship. "Are they using radio frequencies for targeting?" Helena asked. Her voice was steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. "Affirmative, primitive radar locking." Helena took another sip of her coffee. The bitter liquid washed over her tongue. She thought about the coordinates programmed into the nav computer. Sector 793, a mining colony, a slave camp. For 400 years, her people had been digging in the dirt for an arrogant empire that thought it ruled the stars. 400 years of broken promises. 400 years of silence. The silence ended today. "Impact in 5 seconds," the ship's AI reported. "Don't bother with the shields," Helena said quietly. "Just send the teardown sequence." Executing. Outside the hull of the Remembrance, the 3 kinetic kill vehicles closed the final distance. They were moving fast enough to shatter a mountain, but they never reached the ship. 100 miles out, the projectiles simply stopped. They didn't explode. They didn't deflect. They just lost all forward momentum in a fraction of a millisecond, violating every known law of inertia. Then the satellites that fired them began to change. There was no flash of a laser. There was no impact of a missile. The ancient, heavily armored defense platforms simply began to drift apart. The massive bolts unscrewed themselves. The armor plating detached and floated away. The internal wiring unspooled like thread from a bobbin. In less than 3 seconds, the Empire's deadliest automated defense network was reduced to a perfectly organized field of floating spare parts. Disassembled, neutered, turned into junk with a mere whisper of code. Helena set her coffee mug down on the console. It made a soft, definitive clink. "Clear a path," she commanded. "Take us down." Back in the Imperial Pentagon, Admiral Vorlog stared at the main tactical display. The room was so quiet he could hear the hum of the ventilation system. The red dots representing his defense satellites were gone, not destroyed in a fiery explosion. Erased. "What happened?" Vorlog demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Where is the impact debris?" The tactical officer was frantically typing, his hands shaking over the keys. "Sir, there is no debris. The satellites, they're just gone. The telemetry shows they powered down and structurally failed. Simultaneously." "Structural failure. Vorlog stepped closer to the projection, his silver scales catching the harsh light. 3 independent platforms suffered spontaneous structural failure at the exact same millisecond. Yes, sir, the target vessel did not fire a weapon. It didn't even slow down. Vorlog felt a cold, unfamiliar sensation creeping up the back of his neck. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a young recruit in basic training. It was fear. He pushed it down, burying it under layers of pride and anger. It's a trick, Vorlog said. Electronic warfare. They blinded the sensors and bypassed the grid. Sir, the target has breached the atmosphere. It is descending over the North American continent. Sector 793. It's heading straight for the primary mining facility. Vorlog slammed his fist onto the edge of the plotting table. Scramble the interceptors. Order the planetary guard to lock down that facility. Nothing gets in. Nothing gets out. I want that ship grounded, and I want its crew brought to me in chains. The orders went out. The alarms blared across the continent. Thousands of heavily armed Imperial soldiers mobilized, rushing to secure a dusty, miserable strip of land in the Rocky Mountains. They brought tanks. They brought atmospheric gunships. They brought enough firepower to level a city. They thought they were setting a trap. They didn't realize they were just building a stage for a demonstration. High above the clouds, the Remembrance cut through the atmosphere. The friction didn't burn its hull. The air simply parted around it, yielding to a technology so far beyond the Empire's understanding, it looked like magic. Helena Sterling watched the camera feeds as the desolate, scarred landscape of the mining colony came into view. She saw the sprawling, ugly industrial complexes. She saw the cramped, prison-like housing blocks. She saw the heavy machinery chewing into the earth. And she saw the soldiers. Hundreds of them forming a perimeter around the landing zone, their weapons pointed at the sky. Captain, the AI spoke, we are being painted by multiple targeting lasers. Ground-to-air artillery is locked. Should I initiate countermeasures? Helena leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. She looked at the tiny figures on the screen, holding their primitive guns, standing in the way of a promise that was 50,000 years old. No, Helena said. Her voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Let them look. Let them see exactly who they decided to steal from. She reached out and tapped a single icon on her console. Bring us down right in the middle of them and open a broadcast channel to every screen, every data pad, and every comms unit on this rock. It's time they learned who actually owns the dark. The descent of the Remembrance into Sector 793 was not an invasion. It was an eclipse. Over the jagged, rust-red peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the sky did not burn. There was no fiery re-entry trail, no sonic boom to shatter the thin mountain air. The dark vessels simply sank through the atmosphere, silent as a falling shadow. It blotted out the midday sun, casting a massive cooling darkness over the sprawling industrial hellscape of the Imperial mining colony. For 400 years, the Caloran Empire had gouged this earth. They had stripped the mountains bare, erecting brutalist towers of blackened steel and belching smokestacks that choked the horizon. This was the engine of the Empire's economy or Earth, and the fuel for that engine was flesh and blood. On the ground, panic was a living thing. Governor Riley, the Imperial overseer of the facility, stood on the balcony of his command spire, his scaled hands gripping the railing tight enough to draw blood. Below him, the massive excavation pits were grinding to a halt. Heavy machinery the size of city blocks idled. Get the anti-air batteries online. Riley screamed into his comms unit, the sound of his own voice swallowed by the sheer crushing scale of the ship hovering above them. Lock the perimeter. Nothing touches the dirt without my authorization. They tried. The planetary guard was a highly trained, heavily mechanized force. 300 armored gunships swarmed the airspace around the colony like angry wasps. Down in the dust, heavy pulse tanks pivoted their massive turrets, tracking the descending Leviathan. Thousands of soldiers locked their rifles, waiting for the order to turn the sky into a wall of fire. At the Imperial Pentagon, Admiral Vorlog watched the feeds from his command center. The projection table illuminated his silver face in harsh tactical blue. He had 2,000 warships in orbit and a mechanized army on the ground. He had the high ground. He had the numbers. They're in the kill box, the tactical officer reported, his voice tight. Ground batteries have a hard lock. Gunships are holding formation. We have them zeroed. Vorlog stared at the dark, featureless hull of the intruder on the main screen. It defied logic. A ship that small shouldn't have survived the orbital defense grid, let alone casually drifted into a heavily fortified atmosphere. It felt like a deliberate insult, an act of supreme arrogance. "Teach them the cost of trespassing," Vorlog said softly. The order echoed across the quiet bridge. "All ground units fire." The command was relayed. The signal traveled at the speed of light from the Imperial Pentagon to the Rocky Mountains. In the dust of Sector 793, the gunners pulled their triggers. Nothing happened. There was no deafening roar of artillery. There was no blinding flash of plasma. The heavy pulse tanks sat in the dirt, their barrels aimed at the sky, completely inert. The gunships hovering in the air abruptly lost their targeting reticles. The digital scopes on the infantry rifles went black. On the bridge of the Imperial Pentagon, the tactical officer's console erupted in a cascade of red warning runes. "Sir," the officer stammered, his hands hovering uselessly over the manual overrides. "The ground batteries are offline. They didn't fire." "I gave an order," Vorlog barked, stepping toward the table. "Bypass the safeties. Override the local commanders." "It's not the local commanders, Admiral," the officer said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "It's the weapons. The targeting matrix is gone." "Jamming, No, sir, not jammed. Rewritten." The officer looked up, his eyes wide with a profound existential dread. "The fundamental operating code of every weapon system in Sector 793 has been altered. The guns don't recognize the ship as a target. According to our own computers, that ship isn't there." Vorlog felt the breath leave his lungs. He was a master of war. He knew how to counter shields, how to outmaneuver fleets, how to break sieges. But how do you fight an enemy that can reach into the very minds of your machines and calmly change their reality? He looked back at the screen. The remembrance was no longer descending. It had stopped hovering exactly 50 feet above the central processing courtyard of the mining colony. And then the impossible became the profound. Deep in the subterranean shafts of the Rocky Mountains, Elias dropped his pickaxe. Elias was an old man, though he didn't know his exact age. Time in the mines was measured in shifts and quotas, in the aching of bones and the coughing of black dust. He was a descendant of the refugees, the ones who had fallen from the stars 4 centuries ago, begging for help only to be chained to the dark. His hands were scarred thick with calluses, permanently stained with the grease and grime of the Empire's machinery. He had lived his entire life in the shadows, keeping his head down, doing the work, surviving one brutal day at a time. But suddenly the rhythm of his pickaxe felt wrong. There was a hum. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears. It was a vibration that resonated in his chest. A deep, steady, rhythmic pulse that felt like a heartbeat. It cut through the mechanical roar of the ventilation fans and the grinding of the ore crushers. It was clean. It was pure. It was a frequency tuned to his very DNA. Elias let the heavy iron tool slip from his fingers. It clanged against the rocky floor. The Imperial Overseer, a towering armored brute with an electric whip, turned and snarled at him. "Back to work, human. The quota isn't met." Elias didn't look at the Overseer. He looked up toward the ceiling of the shaft, toward the surface. He felt a strange, terrifying warmth spreading through his chest. It was a feeling he had never experienced in his long, miserable life. It was hope. Without a word, Elias stepped out of line. He walked past the Overseer, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. The guard raised his shock whip, ready to bring it down on the old man's back. "I said halt." But as the whip descended, an invisible force caught it. The air around Elias shimmered, a localized distortion of gravity. The whip bounced off thin air, the electrical charge grounding out in a shower of useless sparks. The guard stumbled backward, his eyes wide behind his visor. Elias didn't even notice. He just kept walking. He reached the main cargo elevator. The heavy steel doors, usually locked from the outside, simply slid open as he approached. He stepped inside. He was not alone. From the adjacent tunnels, more figures emerged. Men and women, young and old, their faces covered in soot, their clothes ragged. They were all moving with the same slow, deliberate purpose. No one spoke. No one panicked. They stepped into the massive elevator, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces turned upward. When the elevator reached the surface, the courtyard was a scene of silent chaos. Imperial soldiers were running frantically, screaming into dead radios, slapping the sides of their useless weapons. Governor Riley was shouting from his balcony, his voice cracking with hysteria. But the humans didn't look at the soldiers. They didn't look at the governor. They looked at the ship. It hung in the air, a monolith of perfectly smooth, light-absorbing metal. As the crowd of miners stepped out into the courtyard, a section of the ship's lower hull began to change. There was no ramp, no mechanical door swinging open. The solid metal simply rippled, becoming translucent, then liquid. It was an open invitation. Elias was at the front of the crowd. He walked toward the vessel. The Imperial guards formed a line between the miners and the ship, trying to physically push them back. But the moment a guard laid a hand on a human, they were gently but forcefully repelled, pushed aside by an invisible, immovable barrier of localized pressure. The technology was so advanced it didn't even bother to harm them. It simply rendered them irrelevant. Elias reached the ship. He reached out a trembling, dirt-stained hand. He expected cold metal. Instead, his fingers passed through the rippling surface. It felt like walking through a warm, dry waterfall. He stepped forward and vanished inside. On the bridge of the Remembrance, Captain Helena Sterling watched the boarding manifest update in real time. She stood at the primary viewport holding her coffee mug, watching her people come home. She saw the exhaustion in their gaits. She saw the malnutrition. She saw the 400 years of accumulated suffering inflicted upon them by an empire that considered them nothing more than cheap battery power. Her jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in her cheek. Boarding capacity at 60%, the ship's AI reported. Life support adjusting for malnourished physiology. Medical bays are prepped and standing by. Make sure they're warm, Helena said softly, and get them something real to eat. She didn't gloat. She didn't cheer. There was no joy in this moment, only the grim satisfaction of a debt finally being collected. At the Imperial Pentagon, the bridge was utterly silent. Vorlog watched the feeds from the ground. He watched thousands of slaves simply walk away from his guards, stepping into an alien vessel right under the noses of his elite military. How many? Vorlog asked, his voice barely a whisper. 2,847, Admiral, the tactical officer replied. That is every single registered human worker in Sector 793. Exactly. They knew the count, Calthor the diplomat said from the back of the room. He stepped forward, his face pale. Before they even arrived, they knew exactly who was here. They have been monitoring our internal databases. Vorlog clenched his fists. They are stealing Imperial property. No, Admiral, Calthor corrected him quietly. They are retrieving their own, and they just demonstrated that we are completely powerless to stop them. On the screen, the liquid hull of the Remembrance solidified. The boarding was complete. For a long, agonizing moment, the dark ship simply hung there, in the sky, a silent monument to the Empire's impotence. Then the broadcast began. It didn't just override the military channels. It hit everything. Every civilian data pad, every billboard in the glittering core worlds, every monitor in the Imperial Pentagon, and the massive holographic projection table right in front of Admiral Vorlog. The image of the ship was replaced by the face of Helena Sterling. She wasn't wearing a military uniform. She didn't have a background of flags or symbols of conquest. She was just a woman sitting in a dimly lit command chair, looking directly into the lens, looking directly at them. I am Captain Helena Sterling of the Human Recovery Vessel. Remembrance, she said. Her voice was calm. It was not a shout of anger. It was the terrifying, measured tone of an adult speaking to a misbehaving child. 400 years ago, a colony ship belonging to our people suffered a catastrophic navigational failure. They sought safe harbor in your territory. You took them in, you dismantled their ship, and you enslaved their descendants. Vorlog bristled, stepping closer to the projection. We saved them from the void. We integrated them into our society. Helena couldn't hear him, but her next words answered him anyway. Do not mistake your exploitation for salvation, she said. We have monitored your integration. We have counted every strike of the whip. We have recorded every ounce of ore they pulled from the dark. You did not save them. You used them. She leaned forward slightly. The ambient light caught the hard lines of her face. We are humanity. We keep our promises. We protect our own. And we do not forget. The screen shifted. Next to Helena's face, a massive scrolling list of names, locations, and coordinates began to cascade down the display. It was moving too fast to read a blur of data. You have scattered our people across your colonies. We have located every single one. The total count is 147,936 individuals. The scrolling stopped. The final number hung there glowing in stark white. 147,936. You have exactly 10 standard days. Helena stated, the steel in her voice finalizing the trap. Gather our people. Bring them to the lunar buffer zone. If you comply, we will collect them and leave your empire in peace. She paused. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. If you do not comply, if you attempt to hide them, harm them, or delay, we will not negotiate. We will not fire warning shots. We will simply come and take them. And we will dismantle your empire exactly the way we dismantled your defense grid, piece by piece. The broadcast ended. The screen snapped back to the tactical feeds. On the ground in Sector 793, the Remembrance did not fly away. It did not use thrusters to climb back into orbit. It simply ceased to be there. 1 second it was hovering over the courtyard, and the next there was a deafening thunderclap as the displaced air rushed in to fill the vacuum left behind by a localized quantum jump. The shockwave shattered every glass window in the mining facility, knocking Governor Riley flat on his back. The ship was gone. The 10-day countdown had begun, and the Calaron Empire, for the first time in 10 millennia, knew what it meant to be hunted. 2 days later, Washington, D.C., the old capital. Beneath the towering, polished spires of the imperial administrative buildings buried deep in the earth lay the archives. It was a sprawling subterranean labyrinth built into the skeleton of what was once known as the Smithsonian Institution. The empire had repurposed it centuries ago to store the dead history of conquered worlds. It was a place of dust, shadows, and forgotten things. Dr. Serena sneezed as she wiped a layer of grime from a crystalline data terminal. She was young by the standards of the Imperial Science Directorate, but she possessed a relentless, almost obsessive curiosity. While the military panicked and the politicians argued over how to handle the 10-day ultimatum, Serena had locked herself in the deepest vaults. She needed to understand the enemy. The Imperial narrative was simple. The humans were a lost primitive race that stumbled into their space 400 years ago. But that narrative was currently a pile of ashes. The technology displayed by the Remembrance, the localized gravity manipulation, the instant code rewriting the intra-atmospheric quantum jumping was not primitive. It was orders of magnitude beyond the Empire's most theoretical research. Civilizations didn't jump from broken colony ships to godlike technology in 4 centuries. It was mathematically impossible, unless they already had it. Serena pulled a heavy physical data drive from her satchel. She had managed to secure a blood sample from one of the human miners in Sector 793 before the Remembrance took them. She had sequenced the DNA. Now she was running it against the deepest, most restricted databases in the Empire's historical index. She bypassed the conquered species logs. She ignored the known neighbors index. She dug deeper, breaking 3 layers of Imperial encryption to access a file directory that hadn't been opened in 5,000 years. The directory was simply labeled the Precursors. According to the ancient myths of the Calaron Empire, they were not the first to walk the stars. Long before the Empire built its first hyperdrive, another race had ruled this quadrant of the galaxy. They were builders, explorers, architects of the cosmos. They had seeded worlds, built megastructures, and then they vanished. Approximately 50,000 years ago, they packed up their civilization and left for the deeper universe, leaving behind only ruins and fragmented genetic codes. Serena plugged the drive into the console. "Computer," she whispered, her voice trembling in the quiet dark. "Cross-reference the human genome sample with the archived genetic markers of the precursor race. Run a comparative analysis." The ancient machine hummed. Holographic light filled the dusty room, projecting a massive swirling double helix of the human miner's DNA. Beside it, a second helix materialized, built from fragmented, 50,000-year-old data recovered from a ruined temple world. The 2 strands began to spin, overlapping, searching for commonalities. Serena held her breath. If there was a 10% match, it would mean humanity was an evolutionary offshoot. If there was a 50% match, it would mean they were direct descendants. The computer chimed. The two holographic helixes locked together, glowing a blinding, perfect white. Match 100%. Species classification identical. Serena fell back into her chair, her hands covering her mouth. The light of the hologram reflected in her terrified eyes. They aren't a lost colony, she breathed to the empty room. They didn't evolve somewhere else. She scrambled for her comms unit, her fingers slipping on the keys in her panic. She punched in the emergency override code for Ambassador Calthor. Ambassador, Serena gasped as Calthor's face appeared on the small screen. He looked exhausted, the bags under his eyes heavy from 2 days of endless council meetings. Dr. Serena, this is a restricted channel. What are you doing in the archives? I found them, Ambassador, she said, her voice frantic, tears of sheer existential dread welling in her eyes. I found out who the humans are. You need to get Admiral Vorlog. You need to stop the fleet deployments immediately. Calm down, Doctor. What did you find? They aren't a new threat, sir, Serena yelled, the etiquette of the Empire completely forgotten. We didn't discover them. We are living in their house. 20 minutes later, Serena stood in the secure briefing room of the Imperial Pentagon. Admiral Vorlog was there, his arms crossed over his chest, his silver scales rigid with annoyance. Ambassador Calthor stood beside him, looking distinctly unwell. Serena projected the DNA match onto the main tactical table. Look at the data, she pleaded, pointing at the glowing interlocking helixes. 50,000 years ago, the precursor race left this sector. They had mastered physics. They had transcended the limitations of normal space. They went out into the deep dark to explore. Vorlog scoffed. Myths, fairy tales told to fruffing recruits. It's not a myth, Admiral. The genetics are a flawless match. The human refugees we took in 400 years ago weren't a primitive species. They were a generational exploration ship. They were sent back to chart their old home. When their ship broke down, we took them in, and we put the descendants of gods into our coal mines. The silence in the briefing room was heavier than the gravity of a dying star. You're telling Vorlog said, his voice dangerously low, that this single ship, this remembrance, belongs to the precursors. Yes, Serena said. Admirals, you saw what one of their civilian recovery vessels did to your automated defense grid. You saw them rewrite your weapons with a thought. They aren't preparing for a war. To them, we aren't an enemy army. We are an infestation that got into their old basement. Calthor rubbed his temples, a headache throbbing behind his eyes. The ultimatum. 10 days. They want their people back. And if we don't give them back, Vorlog demanded, you think I should just surrender the Empire's pride boat to Ghost? They aren't ghosts, Admiral, Serena said, her voice hardening. She was a scientist, and the data left no room for pride. If we fight them, we won't lose a war. We will be unmade. We are children holding sharp sticks, threatening the people who invented fire. Vorlog turned away from the table, pacing toward the reinforced windows that overlooked the sprawling military complex of the Imperial Pentagon. Below him, thousands of soldiers were marching. Hundreds of atmospheric fighters were fueling up. The machinery of war was humming, eager for blood. He had never lost. He didn't know how to yield. We have 2,000 warships in orbit, Vorlog said, his voice cold and resolute. They have 10 days to gather their people. Let them come to the lunar buffer zone. We will bring the slaves, but we will also bring the First Fleet. We will surround them. We will negotiate from a position of absolute strength. Admiral, did you not hear a word I just said? Serena pleaded. Your ships cannot hurt them. Everything bleeds, Doctor. Vorlog sneered, turning back to face her. Maybe they were gods 50,000 years ago, but today they are just a ship. We will comply with the gathering, but I will not hand over the Empire's honor without showing them our teeth. Calthor looked at the Admiral, his diplomatic instincts screaming in terror. Vorlog, if you miscalculate this, you will doom us all. I do not miscalculate, Ambassador, Vorlog said, slamming his hand on the table. Initiate the gathering protocols. Rip every human out of the mines, the fields, the factories. Box them up and ship them to the lunar staging ground. But deploy the First Fleet around them in a spherical blockade pattern. The clock was ticking. Across the North American continent, the orders went out. It was a brutal, chaotic process. Imperial enforcers kicked down the doors of the worker housing blocks. Humans were dragged from their sleep, pulled from their dishes, herded like cattle, onto massive unventilated transport barges. Families were separated in the confusion. Children cried in the dark holds of the ships. Old men and women who had never seen the sky were suddenly thrust into orbit, surrounded by the terrifying cold metal of the Imperial military machine. For 7 days, the sky above Earth was a highway of misery. The Imperial economy began to crack. Factories went silent. Supply chains snapped. Without the backbone of human labor, the Empire's infrastructure immediately showed its fragility. But Vorlog didn't care about the economy. He cared about the trap. By the end of the 9th day, the staging ground at the lunar buffer zone was ready. It was a staggering display of military might. 2,000 Caloron warships painted in the jagged, aggressive crimson and black of the First Fleet floated in a massive sphere. Inside the sphere were 50 heavy transport barges crammed with human cargo. They had gathered 117,000 humans. They were 30,000 short. "We couldn't get them all," the logistics officer reported to Vorlog on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion. 30,000 are located in deep core mining facilities on the outer asteroid belt. "We simply didn't have the transit time to extract them before the 10-day deadline." Vorlog smiled. It was a cruel, sharp expression. "Perfect," the Admiral said. "Leave them. We have the bulk of their precious people. We have the high ground. When this Captain Sterling arrives, we will offer her a trade. The humans we have here in exchange for her ship, her technology, and her surrender. And the 30,000 left behind, sir. They are our insurance policies," Vorlog said. "If she fires a single shot, I will execute the hostages in the asteroid belt. Let us see how much humanity cares about their own when a gun is put to their heads." Vorlog stood at the command viewport of the Dominion. The stars were cold and indifferent. The trap was set. The jaws were open. He waited for the gods to walk into his cage. He didn't know that the cage was already broken. He didn't know that a promise made by humanity wasn't a negotiation. It was a law of nature. The 10th day broke over the North American continent, though in the cold vacuum of the lunar buffer zone, there was no dawn. There was only the harsh, unblinking light of distant stars and the terrifying glow of 2,000 Imperial warships. They hung in the void like a swarm of crimson locusts. Admiral Vorlog had arranged the First Fleet into a massive interlocking sphere. It was a flawless tactical formation designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire. At the dead center of this floating fortress sat 50 heavy transport barges. They were brutal, ugly vessels built for hauling ore, not people. Inside their dark, unheated holds, 117,000 human beings waited in terrified silence. They were packed shoulder to shoulder. The air was stale thick with the smell of fierce sweat and 400 years of accumulated despair. Elias, the old miner from Sector 793, sat on the cold iron floor of Barge 7. He had his arms wrapped around his knees, shivering in the near-freezing temperature. Around him, children wept quietly. Mothers held their hands over their babies' mouths, terrified that a stray sound would draw the wrath of the Imperial guards patrolling the catwalks. They didn't know why they had been taken from the dirt. They didn't know if they were being moved to a worse hell or if they were waiting to be executed. But Elias remembered the hum. He remembered the dark ship that had hovered over the courtyard. He closed his eyes and listened, waiting for the frequency that felt like home. On the bridge of the flagship, Dominion Admiral Vorlog stood with his hands clasped behind his back. The massive holographic plotting table bathed his silver scales in a pale blue light. He was a predator, waiting by a tethered goat. "Countdown at 0, Admiral," the tactical officer announced. His voice was tight, strained by the sheer density of the ordnance they were maintaining. Ambassador Calthor stood near the bulkhead, his face a mask of profound anxiety. Dr. Serena's warnings echoed in his mind. "We are children holding sharp sticks. We are living in their house." Calthor looked at the 2,000 blips on the tactical map. It felt like an awful lot of sharp sticks. Surely even gods could bleed if you hit them hard enough. "Keep the targeting matrix locked on the transport barges," Vorlog ordered calmly. "If the intruder makes a hostile move, do not target their ship. Target the slaves. Let us see if their compassion is stronger than their armor." "Admiral, that is a violation of every treaty," Calthor began. "There are no treaties with Ghosts, Ambassador," Vorlog snapped, not turning around. There is only power, and the preservation of the Empire. He didn't get to finish the thought. There was no flash of light. There was no tear in the fabric of space, no swirling vortex of energy to announce their arrival. 1 second, the space outside the blockade was empty. The next second, they were simply there. Not one ship. 4. They hung in the void precisely 100 kilometers from the edge of the Imperial formation. They were perfectly identical to the Remembrance. Sleek, featureless, matte black hulls that seemed to swallow the starlight rather than reflect it. They maintained a diamond formation, completely motionless, defying the gravitational pull of the Earth below them. The bridge of the Dominion erupted into chaos. "Multiple contacts," the sensor officer yelled, slamming his hands against his console. They just materialized, no hyperwake, no thermal bloom. "Lock weapons," Vorlog roared, his military instincts overriding his shock. "All ships power primary batteries. Do not fire until my command." Across the sphere, 2,000 warships charged their plasma coils. The void lit up with the deadly, beautiful glow of thousands of cannons preparing to unleash hell. The sheer energy output made the sensor screens in the command center flicker and whine. The 4 dark ships did nothing. They did not raise shields. They did not power weapons. They just waited. Vorlog stepped to the communication terminal. He felt a surge of triumph. They had come. They had walked right into the kill box. "Unknown vessels," Vorlog broadcast, pitching his voice to echo with absolute, unshakable authority. "This is Admiral Vorlog of the Caleron Empire. You are surrounded by the First Fleet. We have gathered 117,000 of your people. They are currently locked in the barges at the center of our formation." He paused, letting the weight of the number sink in. "But we did not bring them all." Vorlog smiled, a cruel parting of his scaled lips. 30,000 of your people remain in the deep core mining facilities of the outer asteroid belt. Those facilities have been rigged with high-yield thermal explosives. My thumb is on the detonator. Calthor closed his eyes in horror. The Admiral was pushing all their chips into the center of the table. It was madness. "Here are my terms." Vorlog continued, staring hard at the silent black ships on the screen. "You will power down your vessels. You will surrender your command crews to my custody. You will turn over your navigational and propulsion databases to the Imperial Science Directorate. If you do this, I will allow your people to live. If you attempt to flee, or if you fire a single shot, I will vaporize the transports holding the 117,000, and I will detonate the outer belt mines. You have 60 seconds to comply." Silence hung over the communication channel. The seconds ticked away on the master clock. 10, 20, 30. Vorlog's smile widened. He had them. You cannot fight when your enemy holds everything you love at gunpoint. At 45 seconds, the air on the bridge of the Dominion shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a change in atmospheric pressure. The hairs on the back of Calthor's neck stood up. The lights in the command center flickered, dimming to a sickly yellow before surging back to a blinding white. The massive holographic plotting table in the center of the room abruptly shut down. The tactical map vanished. In its place, a new image materialized. It wasn't a two-dimensional broadcast on a flat screen. It was a full, high-fidelity, three-dimensional projection standing directly in the middle of the Imperial Bridge. It bypassed their firewalls. It bypassed their encryption. It treated their most secure military network like a broken toy. It was Captain Helena Sterling. She stood tall, her dark jacket zipped up against the cold of her own ship. She wasn't looking at a camera. She was looking directly at Vorlog. Her eyes were hard-tired and burning with the quiet, devastating fury. Vorlog took an involuntary step back, his hand dropping to the sidearm at his hip. "Admiral Vorlog," Helena said. Her voice didn't come from the speakers. It seemed to resonate from the metal bulkheads themselves, vibrating through the floor plates. "You think you understand leverage," she said softly. The rhythm of her words was slow, deliberate. "You think holding a knife to the throat of a child makes you powerful. It doesn't. It just makes you a coward with a knife." "Surrender your ships, Captain," Vorlog shouted, trying to project his authority against the terrifying presence of the hologram. "I will give the order. I will burn them all." Helena didn't blink. She took a slow step forward in the projection. Vorlog's guards raised their rifles, aiming at the phantom of light. Some of our people may have been left behind, Helena said, her voice dropping an octave, settling into a cold, unbreakable iron. I don't deny that you have firepower. I see your 2,000 ships. I see your plasma coils. I see the fear in your eyes. She stopped pacing. She squared her shoulders. But those innocent people in the dark, those people you have beaten and starved and broken for 4 centuries, they deserve to go home. They deserve to see the sky. They deserve to live without the shadow of your whip. Helena tilted her chin up. That is what makes us human, Admiral. We do not negotiate with terrorists. We do not trade blood for steel. And we never ever abandon our own. Vorlog sneered, his finger hovering over the command console. Then you just killed them all. No, Helena said. I am turning off your lights, and I promise you, you will release all of them today. Helena raised her right hand. She didn't press a button. She didn't shout a command. She simply snapped her fingers. The sound of the snap echoed across the bridge, and then the Caleron Empire died. It didn't happen with explosions. It didn't happen with fire. It happened with absolute suffocating silence. Across the lunar buffer zone, the plasma coils of 2,000 warships instantly went dark. The hum of the massive hyperdrive spooled down to nothing in a fraction of a second. The artificial gravity plating beneath the boots of 200,000 Imperial sailors simply ceased to function. On the bridge of the Dominion, the main lights shattered. Emergency red strobes failed to activate. The life support scrubbers wheezed and died. Report! Vorlog screamed, floating weightless in the dark, grabbing the edge of the plotting table to anchor himself. Engineering report. There was no answer. The comms were dead. Tactical fire, the main batteries, destroy the barges. I can't, the tactical officer sobbed in the darkness. There's nothing, though. Consoles are dead. The manual backups are dead. The mechanical relays are fused. We have zero power. They were blind. They were deaf. They were floating in a graveyard of their own making. 2,000 of the most advanced warships in the known galaxy had been turned into 2,000 drifting steel coffins in less time than it took to draw a breath. Outside the Dominion, the real terror began. The 4 dark human ships moved. They did not fly. They did not use thrusters. They engaged their quantum drives. To the naked eye, they simply vanished from the edge of the formation. Millions of miles away, in the deep core asteroid belt, 30,000 human slaves were huddled in the freezing shafts of the outer mines. Imperial guards stood over them, their hands resting on the physical detonators wired to the structural supports of the cavern. The order had just come through a minute ago: wait for the signal, then blow the charges. A guard raised his radio to his mouth to confirm readiness. He never spoke the words. The rock wall of the cavern simply ceased to exist. It didn't explode. It dissolved. Through the massive, perfectly smooth hole in the asteroid, the matte black hull of a human recovery vessel appeared. Before the guards could comprehend what they were seeing, the air pressure in the cavern shifted. An invisible, localized gravity wave swept through the room. The Imperial guards were slammed against the far walls, pinned there by a force equivalent to 10 times Earth normal gravity. Their bones groaned, their weapons were crushed flat in their holsters. But the human miners didn't feel a thing. The hull of the ship rippled and turned to liquid. The miners, driven by the same deep rhythmic hum that Elias had felt days ago, stood up. They dropped their tools. They walked toward the ship. It took exactly 45 seconds to evacuate 30,000 people from 12 different asteroid facilities simultaneously. Back at the lunar buffer zone, Vorlog stared out the heavy reinforced glass of his dead viewport. There were flashes of displaced starlight. The 4 black ships reappeared. They were exactly where they had been a minute ago. Admiral, Calthor whispered, clinging to a bulkhead in the zero gravity. His datapad, a standalone civilian model running on a separate battery, suddenly chimed. It was receiving a tight beam transmission. Calthor looked at the screen. The color drained from his face entirely. What is it? Vorlog demanded, his voice cracking. What are they doing? The outer belt, Calthor breathed. The detonators were never triggered. The guards are pinned. The mines are empty, Admiral. They took them. They took all 30,000 hostages. It took them less than a minute. Vorlog let go of the table. He drifted backward in the dark, his mind fracturing. It wasn't possible. You couldn't cross the solar system perfectly, extract tens of thousands of people from heavily guarded subterranean bunkers, and return all before a man could finish a cup of coffee. It was absolute, undeniable supremacy. Out in the void, the 50 transport barges holding the remaining 117,000 humans were suddenly bathed in a soft, warm golden light. The Imperial tractor beams holding them in place had died with the warships. Now a new force took hold of them. It was gentle. It was precise. Slowly, carefully, the ugly, rusted barges were pulled out of the center of the dead Imperial fleet. They drifted toward the 4 human vessels. As they approached, the massive black ships extended their hulls, expanding outward like living organisms, creating massive pressurized docking bays that swallowed the Imperial barges whole. Inside Barge 7, Elias felt the temperature rise. The bitter cold vanished, replaced by a comfortable, soothing warmth. The harsh, flickering lumen strips in the ceiling were replaced by a soft, natural daylight that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The heavy iron doors of the hold groaned, then slid open. Elias stood up. The crowd of terrified people parted. Standing in the doorway was a human. He was dressed in a dark, simple uniform. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't carry a whip. He held a large, steaming, metallic thermos. The man looked at the sea of dirty, exhausted, terrified faces. His eyes shone with tears he refused to let fall. He stepped inside. He poured a small ceramic cup from the thermos. A rich, bitter, beautiful aroma filled the stale air of the hold. He walked up to Elias. He held out the cup. "It's over," the man said softly. "You're safe now. Drink this. It will help with the shock." Elias took the cup with trembling hands. He brought it to his lips. The coffee was hot. It burned his tongue, but he didn't care. It tasted like earth. It tasted like dignity. For the first time in 400 years, an old man in the dark began to weep, and they were tears of absolute joy. On the bridge of the Remembrance, Helena Sterling watched the docking sequence complete. Every single soul was aboard. 147,936. They hadn't lost a single one. "Captain," the AI reported softly, "all individuals are secured. Medical triage is underway. Navigational computers are spooled and ready for the jump back to the Orion arm." "Hold position," Helena said. She turned back to her console. She typed a sequence of commands, opening one final one-way communication channel to the dead flagship floating in front of her. On the Dominion, the emergency backup screens flickered to life. They were low-res static-laced, but the image of Helena Sterling was clear. Vorlog was floating in the dark, defeated, broken, a commander without an army. Calthor was beside him, listening intently. "I told you I was going to turn out your lights," Helena said. "In approximately 3 hours, your ship's systems will reboot. Your life support will come back online. Your weapons will not. I have permanently deleted the targeting algorithms from your entire fleet. You will have to learn how to fly without guns." Vorlog didn't speak. He just stared at her. The arrogance was completely gone, hollowed out by the sheer terrifying reality of his own insignificance. "We are leaving," Helena continued, "but we are not leaving you with nothing." On the dead holographic table, a small physical object materialized out of thin air. It dropped onto the glass with a soft clack. It was a crystalline data drive, glowing with an inner light. "That crystal contains a map," Helena explained. "It outlines the safe routes through this quadrant. It marks the dead zones. It warns of spatial anomalies that your primitive sensors cannot detect. It is the key to surviving in a galaxy that is far older, far larger, and far more dangerous than you can possibly comprehend." Calthor pushed himself off the bulkhead floating toward the table. He reached out and carefully picked up the crystal. "Why, I mean," Calthor asked, his voice rough. "After what we did to them, after what we tried to do to you today, you could have annihilated us. You could have cracked this planet in half. Why leave us a map?" Helena looked at the ambassador. The anger in her eyes had faded, replaced by a profound, ancient weariness. "Because 50,000 years ago, we were exactly like you," Helena said. "We were arrogant. We were cruel. We thought the universe belonged to us because we carried the biggest sticks. We made mistakes that cost billions of lives. We had to learn the hard way." She leaned closer to the screen. "We are leaving you the map because we are better than you. Because true power isn't measured by how many ships you can destroy. It's measured by how much mercy you can afford to show to those who do not deserve it. She reached out to cut the feed. Then she paused. One last thing, Ambassador. Helena's eyes hardened. The weariness vanished, replaced by the unbreakable steel of a protector. Tell your emperor, tell your high council, tell the children in your academies. Let it be written in the bedrock of your worlds. If you ever reach out into the dark again, if you ever lay a hand on the innocent, the weak, or the lost, the projection flickered. When you call for help, humans will come. Always. The screen went black. Outside the viewport of the Dominion, the four dark ships did not turn around. They did not engage thrusters. They simply ceased to exist. The space where they had been was empty, filled only with the cold light of the stars. The massive sphere of the Imperial fleet floated in the silence, 2,000 warships drifting uselessly in the dark, their hulls casting long shadows over the earth below. They had brought an armada to fight a war. They had been handed a map and told to grow up. In the subterranean depths of the Smithsonian archives, Dr. Serena sat alone in the dark, staring at the perfectly matched strands of holographic DNA. She had watched the feeds. She had seen the blackout. She had seen the mercy. She reached out and turned off the projector. The Caloran Empire had survived the day, but the illusion of their supremacy was dead forever. They were no longer the masters of the galaxy. They were just tenants living in the shadow of giants who had finally decided to visit home. And somewhere in the deep, uncharted dark of the Orion Arm, 147,000 people were drinking hot coffee, wrapped in warm blankets, watching the stars blur into lines of light as they finally, after 400 years, went home.